All right. So now we're going to talk about it more conceptually, hopefully. This is talking about with just like two input units, two hidden units, and one output unit. Neural networks have like many, many units, sometimes probably trillions, right? Or maybe not trillions, but a lot. So you have you have these hidden or input units, right? They get input from usually the environment, some sort of external stimuli, and then they send activation to, a bunch of hidden units, right? And these hidden units only get activation from either other hidden units or from the input units. And then they send activation either to other hidden units or an output unit, in this case, just to the output units. And then the output units output something, right? Usually a decision of some sort. And we can express, each one of these units as being like uj, right? And then the hidden units could be ui, right? So this is the top input unit is u1, and then it goes down to u2, u3, u4, right? And then the hidden unit will be u1, u2, u3, u4, right? Let's just, just to make things simple, let's just talk about the activation to one hidden unit. And each one of these, so the hidden unit is going to, with this hidden unit, it's going to be unit two, is going to get activation from all the input units by some weight, right? And the weights can be thought of as weight ij. So this is weight, this will be weight ij. So it means that it's going to be weight two, right? So if we say it's unit two, so weight two, it's sending activation from unit one. Weight two one is sending activation from unit one to unit two. Weight two two is sending activation to unit two from unit two of the input layer, whereas weight two three is going to be sending activation to the hidden unit two from the input unit three, and then weight two four is going to be sending activation to the hidden unit two from the input unit four. All right. And of course, the total input to that unit, let's say, is going to be the sum of the weighted activation, where the activation is just equal to U of UJ, right? So the activation, sorry, UJ will be the activation of each input unit, right? So U1 times weight 2, 1, that will equal the first weighted activation. And then you just sum it up for all the input units. And we're going to talk about this. So yeah, you can have different activation functions. So before the activation function was basically if the activation is below a threshold, don't do anything. And if it's above a threshold or equal to a threshold, then do something. Then activate, right? Well, you don't have to have it be like that. It can be that's a sort of a binary threshold activation function, but you can have it be different. So I'll show you some of that here. So, actually, first thing I wanted to point out is that, of course, each one of these units, every single unit in the network is going to have its own little total input associated with it. Okay, so I only did it for one unit, but it's going to have it for all the units. Okay, so now we'll talk about the activation functions, right? One idea is that as the total input increases, so does the activation of that unit. It would just be called a linear activation function. Or we could have it be like this, where as the input increases, nothing happens until it hits a certain threshold. Then it increases linearly. We would call that a threshold linear. We have a sigmoidal activity, right? But the one that we used before was called the binary threshold, where basically in this example, t, right? When we talk about t, that was the threshold. Well, don't do anything when t equals if t is less than zero. But if t once t hits zero or goes above over zero, then fire, right? So all right. So these neural networks, right, multi-layer neural networks, they're called feed-forward networks, where activation spreads forward in the system, meaning that the input units get activated, they send their activation to the hidden units, and then the hidden units get activated and send their activation to the output units. Okay. And there's this thing called backpropagation. Backpropagation is essentially the equivalent of the perceptron convergence rule, except now we're talking about multi-layer networks. It's a little bit more mathematically complicated. I don't really know how to do it, but I kind of know vaguely. What happens is this algorithm, right, will modify all the connection weights of a given unit proportional to the error that it produces. Now, the question is, where does the error, who's to blame, right? It goes through the activation goes through the input units, the input layer, and then the hidden layer. And then the hidden layer to the output layer. So which connection or which weights should be adjusted? And who's more responsible for the error? And what basically backpropagation does is it tries to attribute the error to different units or to different weights, and then it adjusts it proportionally to how much error it thinks it produces. Okay. And of course, this is all based on this delta parameter, which is just the amount of error, right? Input out in the intended input or output, sorry, the intended output minus the actual output. And there's less back propagation when there's less error. All right, so let's show this, right? So I have this little thing here, right? It could be anything, right? This is a multi-layer network, neural network. These are the input units, these are the hidden units, and these are the output units, right? So imagine if, these three input units get activated by some sort of external stimulus, right? Well, they send their activation to the hidden units like that. And then those hidden units get activated. And of course, so do the input units because you're probably still looking at the picture of something. So the external stimulus is still exciting the input units. Okay. But so while that's happening, so the input units send activation so while the input units are continuously being stimulated, they're going to send their activation to the hidden units. And then those hidden units are going to send activation to the output units while the input units simultaneously send their activation to the hidden units. Okay, so now if you look at this, right? So I've tried to represent like this. So say red means that it's the most activation. Okay, so these red units are activated the most, the orange units are activated less, and the green units are activated even less. Okay, now imagine though that what if the red units are the only appropriate units that should be activated, right? Maybe you're trying to say the word dog, and these two units are the only ones that uniquely correspond to the word dog, and all these other units are just noise, right? Well, what's going to happen is there's going to be an error signal. Okay, each of these units is going to send a unit is going to send an error signal back and tell, okay, hey, like this orange one and this green one, they're going to tell their connection weights. They're going to say, hey, shut up. Don't send me that information. I don't want to hear it, right? And so these units that send the weights, the connections, the weights that are associated with the connections that link the hidden units to the like yellow or yellowish orange and green output units, those weights will be decreased as a result in a similar way to how the perceptron conversion rule worked. Uh, and so, yeah, back propagation, the error signals are sent to other units about how to change the connection weights and how they should be changed. Okay. And then that's why we call this an error-based model, and learning is error-based. So if once the weights have been adjusted and enough learning has occurred, there won't be as much error involved, and so there won't be as much yeah, these units, the output units that were yellow and green, are no longer going to be active, right? Because yeah, there's no error involved. And so it converges on the right thing eventually, right? So the correct response eventually, uh, you converge on the correct response because of back propagation and error-based learning. The other thing I wanted to say is, unlike the symbolic models, artificial intelligence models. Here, a stimulus, instead of it being represented by like, you know, some symbolic, structure, now a stimulus is represented by a pattern of activity that's distributed across other units. Okay. Which has some implications, which we'll talk about in a second. But first, I want to just give another example of actually, in the next, we'll stop here, and in the next video, we'll start with another example